For centuries, classical economics modeled industrial production as a straightforward equation. If a nation wanted to produce more output, it simply needed to add more physical capital, like factories and machines, and more labor to run them. It wasn't until the massive industrial mobilization of the Second World War as per capita economic growth over a century. When economists mapped the historical data, they found that raw increases in physical capital and labor explained only a tiny fraction of that growth. The remaining 90% of this chart represents an unexplained surplus. Economists termed this massive block total factor productivity. Total factor productivity is the portion of output not explained by the volume of inputs used in production. Economist Moses Abramovitz looks at this glaring gap between theory and reality and concluded that this unmeasured component was essentially some sort of measure of our ignorance. That admission launched a decades-long theoretical effort to mathematically dismantle this block of ignorance. To understand why modern nations actually became wealthier, the discipline had to figure out how to measure the abstract societal and qualitative changes that classical economics had left out. The methodology devised to chip away at this primitive residual became known as growth accounting. The objective was to parse the data for hidden, qualitative improvements that had previously been thrown into the generic buckets of labor or capital. This required assigning hard mathematical weights to abstract human behaviors, educational systems, and structural shifts in the workforce. The inherent risk in this approach was the attempt to force complex qualitative human history into rigid, isolated quantitative formulas. Economist Edward Denison led the charge in this effort, attempting to systematically quantify these hidden variables for the post-war era. Denison's resulting framework would serve as the definitive benchmark for analyzing the anatomy of American prosperity. Denison compiled a comprehensive dataset analyzing the sources of U.S. labor productivity growth during the 31 years from 1948 to 1979. This chart shows Denison's baseline calculation for that period. He found that pure total factor input, raw labor hours and capital combined, barely moved at all. This left 99% of the total 1.81% growth rate as an unexplained primitive residual. To shrink this, Denison looked beyond raw hours worked to measure labor quality, introducing the concept of human capital. Human capital refers to the economic value of a worker's experience and skills. By tracking the earnings premiums associated with longer schooling, Denison calculated that the rise in the educational level of the average worker directly accounted for 23% of total productivity growth. He then targeted economies of scale. Economies of scale are the cost advantages that enterprises obtain due to their size, where the cost per unit of output decreases with increasing scale. Factoring in the productivity bonus from larger national markets and metropolitan concentration explained another 17% of the total growth. Resource allocation, specifically the shift of labor from low-yield farming to high-yield occupations in industry and commerce, removed an additional 13%. Through this rigorous deconstruction, Denison successfully shrank the primitive residual from 99% down to an adjusted final residual of 51%, which he attributed to the advance of applied knowledge. Denison had drastically reduced the mathematical shadow over the economy, yet even his exhaustive accounting left over half of all labor productivity growth as an unmeasured black box. This conclusion was immediately challenged by Dale Jorgensen, whose competing model analyzed the exact same 1948 to 1979 period, but arrived at radically different conclusions. Jorgensen made a major methodological shift. He measured output using gross value added, instead of Denison's baseline of net national income. Net national income subtracts the depreciation of capital assets, while gross value added leaves that depreciation in the total. Because this gross measurement inherently includes the capital consumed during production, it structurally forces a reevaluation of physical capital's overall weight in the economy. Jorgensen also introduced the concept of capital quality. Capital quality measures the economic impact of industries shifting toward short-lived but highly productive equipment, rather than long-lived static structures. Accounting for capital quality on a gross output basis mathematically doubled the contribution of physical capital to 46%, dwarfing Denison's 22% calculation. This larger capital weight created a drastic cascading effect across the rest of the growth accounting equation. Jorgensen shrank the unexplained total factor productivity down to just 24% of total output growth. Tweaking the mathematical definition of output moved the primary engine of wealth creation from abstract human knowledge back to physical investment. This exposed the inherent vulnerability of the entire growth accounting discipline. The mathematical models were completely beholden to the subjective boundaries of the definitions chosen by the economist. The accounting wars demonstrated the danger of confusing an economic model for absolute objective reality. Moses Abramovitz offered an ultimate systemic critique of this entire debate. Despite their bitter differences, he noted that both Dennison and Jorgensen relied on the exact same flawed foundational premise. That premise assumed growth sources, capital, labor, and technology, act independently. In reality, these forces are mutually dependent. New technological knowledge is useless until physically embodied in new capital equipment, and the dependency runs in reverse. Without continuous technological progress, rapid capital accumulation hits a wall of diminishing returns. This interaction extends to human capital. Technological progress dictates the earnings premiums rewarding higher education. Technology actively induces educational growth by automating manual labor and shifting economic demand toward complex, high-skill administrative and technical services. Abramovitz referred to this as the interaction problem. Because these variables feed into and amplify one another, calculating their isolated sums will always misrepresent their true joint contribution. Attempting to measure these variables independently forces economists to either mathematically double-count their impact or completely miss the symbiotic multipliers that actually drive prosperity. This understanding challenged the classical view of technology as an exogenous scientific miracle that simply drops from the sky outside the economic system. Instead, technology is a costly, high-risk economic investment driven by market incentives, the scale of operations, and the constant threat of corporate competition. This closes the ultimate feedback loop. Economic growth directly funds the very technological research and development investments required to sustain further economic growth. Abramovitz's final thesis on this was clear. The engine of modern economic growth cannot be found by tallying the isolated, static sums of capital, labor, or knowledge. True growth is found only in the dynamic, compounding interaction between human capability, physical investment, and the relentless advance of ideas.